Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NESP Climate Systems Hub Understanding and Strengthening Climate Change Attribution webinar. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Helen Blaustein, and I'm the Climate Science Knowledge Broker for Victoria for the NESP Climate Systems Hub. And I'm embedded within the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action here in Victoria. So today we're talking about the rapidly emerging field of climate science attribution, and it's going to be a really interesting session. I'll introduce our first speaker in a moment. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of Naarm or Melbourne, where myself and the speakers are all joining you from today. We pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and would also like to extend our deepest respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today. We recognise the important role traditional knowledge plays in understanding Australia's climate. We know we've got a really wide audience dialing in from all across Australia and potentially overseas, so please take a moment to think about the traditional owners from where you are joining us from. So, housekeeping, just a few housekeeping points before we begin. Please ensure your microphone is muted. The webinar is being recorded and the link will be available via the NESP Climate Systems Hub website after the webinar, and I believe you'll also receive an email with the link to the recording. So we do encourage you to ask questions. In fact, the more the merrier, and this can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A function. You can see for most of us at the bottom of the screen, but it might be on the side of your screen as well. We'll, of course, address as many questions as possible live later in the session, but I encourage you to get in early as we don't always have time to address all questions. So if you pop them in there, then we'll be able to see them and get to as many as possible later on. Now I'd like to set the scene and provide a bit of background about the Climate Systems Hub webinars. If this is your first one, welcome. These webinars are designed to provide an opportunity for learning and interaction with a broad range of topics and experts. We've had a great range of presentations through the year, and today is going to be another one. So without any further delay, I'd like to warmly welcome our first speaker today, Dr. Pandora Hope. Pandora leads the National Environmental Science Program Climate Systems Hub Extreme Events Explained project. Her research focuses on understanding the influences on the climate and extreme events, and she is very keen to ensure that research outcomes will be useful to decision makers. She works at the Bureau of Meteorology and also with the Australian Climate Service, and was a lead author of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. Over the past year, Pandora has been co-supervisor of Hannah and Francine, who you will hear from later on. Pandora will now provide some background on attribution and the research that she's been leading with the team this year. Over to you, Pandora.
Thanks, Helen. I'm very excited to be here today and share some of the great stuff that the team has been doing, but also hear from Francine and Hannah later about their research with decision makers. So let's get into it. Now I should be able to forward the slide. Okay, there we go. I think we've jumped forward a bit too far. Here we go. So as Helen said, I lead a project called Extreme Events Explained. And in that project, we have really two sections, one around the variability in the processes around extreme events, but also the attribution. So the aim of the program is to provide context and understanding around extremes on a range of timescales, develop confidence in that understanding and what that means for future climate extremes, and how we're going to reach our goals by understanding how contextualization of extreme weather and climate events can be used in making decisions around future risk. And to meet that need, we are aiming to improve and refine approaches to attributing climate change and the role of natural climate variability. So as I said, this webinar is really focusing on the attribution part of our team's work. Sorry, Tani, I can't seem to control my slides. Can you move it forward? Thanks. All right. So what is attribution? If we look to the IPCC, it says that attribution is the process of evaluating the contribution of one or more causal factors to an observed weather or climate event. For the sake of this particular webinar, we're really focusing on extreme event attribution. So if an event has happened recently, what were the contributors to that event? How much did climate change play a role? And thinking about how we might be able to do that, we are developing methods to improve that approach. Stepping back, there's actually a lot going on. As Helen said, this is an emerging field, and you can find more about attribution in a lot of different places. And there are a lot of event attribution efforts coming out worldwide. On the right there, we've got the World Weather Attribution. They're looking at events that have high impact around the globe. Here in NESP, obviously, we've got a few really great explainers that you can access on those links. And the ABC has recently talked to me and Sarah Perkins, Kirkpatrick, about what an alternative universe could be used to actually understand attribution. And there's a nice explainer come out of the climate for the Centre for Excellence for Climate Extremes up on the left there. So there's lots of ways to find out more about attribution. So how can we attribute causes? So we want to improve and refine our approaches. And one of the ways we can do that is, actually, there are many ways to do that. And each one of the ways can give us a different statement about what the event was caused by. So we can think about the data sets that underlie our methods. We can use observations or seasonal forecasts or large ensembles of climate information run by modelling institutions from around the world. We can build statistical models of all the different contributors, or we can compare the current climate, which for the sake of illustration is the one on the right there, and how many times we might exceed a heat extreme, with a world with no human influence, or a counterfactual. And this is an approach that we've used extensively using 3 different methods that I'll quickly describe. We can look at the large ensemble from the modelling institutions around the world and see how often in the current climate we might exceed a particular heat threshold. In this case, this is an approach developed by Jen Tolhurst, and in late August we were warned that the winter might break the current record for Australia. And using some tables that they'd pre-computed, they came up with the statement, after evaluating the models, in climate models, Australian winters that exceed mean temperatures of 16.5 degrees are at least 18 times more likely due to anthropogenic climate change. Now, could we make that simpler for decision makers? Perhaps we might say the heat event was 18 times more likely due to climate change. Another approach will tell us something about the magnitude of the extreme. On the diagram on the right, there's a distribution in grey, and that's from the world with no anthropogenic forcing at all. And we can see that there's a range from about -2 to 2 of this anomaly of the warmest winter on record. But in the current climate, which are the little blocks at the top of the diagram, it's actually shifted. So that yellow distribution is now where the shifted climate sits. And so the anomaly that we had, which was almost 2 degrees above normal, and we find that about more than 1 degree of that was because of climate change. And that's work done by Surendra Ranier. And we can also use a forecast system with modified forecasts. So we might forecast a heat extreme, in this case, the black summer temperatures, and we can see how well was it forecast. We can then reforecast that event with a modified initial state and lowered greenhouse gases. And with those, we might see a slightly different forecast. In this case, you can quickly see the red there is the warmer conditions than normal, and they are much reduced in a climate without climate change. Comparing the two, the current climate anomaly at the top with those very deep red warm conditions compared to a lower greenhouse gas world, and we find that during the event, which had a 1.3 degree anomaly across Australia, 0.8 is attributable to climate change. So we might be able to make a statement about the intensity of the event. So the heat event was around 1.5 times more intense due to climate change. This approach is very exciting because we can also explore the weather that contributed to that heat extreme, or even run different kinds of experiments to explore the El Niño state or the state of the Indian Ocean dipole. So all of this is great, and we felt like we were perhaps making some really useful steps forward, thinking about the language we used, the underlying robust methods, evaluating our models. But how can we understand whether this contextualization of extreme weather and climate events can be used in making decisions around future risk? That's what we really want to make sure is happening. So we thought about how we were going about our work. As researchers, we were talking with the people that might make our results operational, so the climate services people, and then through the communications, such as Helen, knowledge brokers, and that would then reach the decision makers. But what about if we flipped the value chain and we actually started with the decision makers, asked them, how could they use attribution science in their decision making? Bring it back through the understanding of language experts, climate services people, right back to the researchers, and then use that information to help us improve our research plans and really focus our work to make sure it's having impact. We had a few workshops where we invited some stakeholders, particularly people from the Australian Climate Service. And one of those, Eric Lead, was super excited by this idea and thought, wouldn't it be great if we could get some students to work with us and actually go out and interview the decision makers and see what they can tell us, and then work with the scientists to see if they could meet those needs. And that's where we are today. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks so much, Pandora, for that excellent presentation. So I can see a few questions already in the Q&A. Thanks for those, and please keep them coming. What we'll do though is continue with the presentations and come to the questions at the end. So I'd like to really warmly welcome our next speakers, Hannah Bourbon and Francine Machin. So Hannah and Francine are finishing their honours in Science Advanced Global Challenges at Monash University. They are the two primary researchers in the Attribution Uplift project, which Pandora has just described the outline of. Francine is interested in the importance of effective science communication for decision makers, and Hannah is passionate about supporting science policy communication and collaboration to reduce climate risks. And as you've heard, in 2023, Hannah and Francine signed up to undertake their research project with the Bureau of Meteorology and the NESP Climate Systems Hub, this Extreme Events Explained project, to strengthen the delivery of extreme event attribution information to decision makers. How did they go about that? Well, conducting detailed interviews with over 40 decision makers, so that's quite a task, across all levels of government in Northern and Southern Australia and at a national level. Today, they'll present their findings to you. So over to you, Francine, I think.
Hello. Thanks so much for the warm welcome.
Sorry, Hannah.
You're so fine. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Helen and Pandora. And thank you all so much for being here today. It's an incredible turnout, and we're really, really looking forward to sharing our research and key findings with all of you. So again, for those of you who don't already know us, my name is Hannah, and I'm partnered with Francine. We're both Global Challenges students from Monash University, completing our honours research. We've been really fortunate in that we've been able to complete this research together, but also in partnership with our wonderful supervisors, so Dr. Pandora Hope, Eric Lead and Dr. Brenda Mackey from the Bureau of Meteorology, NESP of course, and lastly, the Australian Climate Service. And of course, we've been working with our wonderful knowledge broker team. So we'd like to extend our thanks to Helen, Sarah, David, and Ramona for all your support. And of course, Tani for helping us with our presentation for the webinar today. So you might be wondering again what our year-long project aim was, and that was to strengthen the delivery of extreme event attribution science, which Pandora covered earlier, to Australian climate risk decision makers across government levels. And the extreme event attribution science we looked at had a particular focus on extreme heat and extreme rainfall events. So we've achieved our aim through a 3-phased project. For starters, we identified local and state government decision-making needs in northern tropical Australia and temperate southeastern Australia, so 2 opposing climate and governance regions within Australia. We then compared these decision-making needs to federal government decision-making needs, and once we'd identified the key needs, took this forward to a range of expert scientists and communicators to assess and explore their capabilities to meet these different decision-making needs. So for starters, we're going to talk about the key findings of phases 1 and 2 of our project, so those key decision-making needs. So as Helen mentioned, we had the privilege of getting to interview 43 experts in climate risk decision-making, and we're so grateful to all of you for your valuable insight if you're tuning into the webinar today. As Helen mentioned, we tried to cover a range of different government levels, so local to federal, different regions, so southeastern, the northern tropical region. And then, of course, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see we tried to cover a range of different sectors, so climate governance, infrastructure, and education, just to name a few of the different examples. Again, we'd like to thank anyone that partook in our research.
So when we interviewed these 43 decision makers, we first started by asking about their familiarity with extreme event attribution. So getting an understanding of if they'd heard of it before or if they understood the concept. And a large majority, so 79%, were familiar with it. However, we found a bit of a gap because only about 19% were currently using attribution science. So this is where we tailored our research to try and understand where this gap was and what was stopping people using the science. So in our interviews, we introduced 3 attribution statements to all of the decision makers. And these are tailored, like Pandora mentioned earlier, across 3 different areas of attribution. So frequency, magnitude, and intensity. And we wanted to get an idea of if decision makers were given a statement like this, did they like them? Were they able to use them? What they didn't like about them, and where they think the communication could be improved. And we had 5 really interesting findings. So language was the area where decision makers could see the most improvement in the statements. Also in methodology, impact attribution, action-oriented communication, and scientific comprehension. And we're going to talk about each of these now and what that means for attribution communication. So the first important improvement that decision makers wanted to see from attribution communication was key terms in the statements needed to be defined better, as well as phrases. So in a statement that might mention the word normal or an event or intensity, decision makers really wanted to know what these terms meant. They're quite common, I guess, scientific jargon words, but to a decision maker or someone not in the field every day, it was really important for these to be defined. I did my research in the northern tropical areas of Australia, and something that came up a lot was also the accessibility of the statements and translating to First Nations languages so that the science is also accessible. So with a statement that was presented like this one, where it says the heat event was 3 degrees above normal, and 1 degree of that was because of climate change. Statements we got a lot were around normal for who and where, or how do you justify normal? So decision makers would read the statement and want to know what that normal meant. The second need that emerged that was really important for decision makers to see an improvement in was the background around methodology. So they were interested in the science and interested in the statements, but they wanted to know how we got there and what kind of approaches that we were using. So an example, when presented with the statement around the rainfall or heat event was 1.5 times more intense, decision makers said, what does the statement actually mean if there's no baseline to compare it to? So that's looking at this 1.5 times more intense. Is it 1.5 times more intense than yesterday or 20 years ago? There needed to be that understanding of what we're comparing to.
Another really important decision-making need that was highlighted was impact attribution. So decision makers mentioned that they needed the attribution statements to be accompanied by impact attribution statements. So decision makers were asking the question, how has climate change exacerbated extreme event impacts more specifically? Just as a key example, local decision makers were really interested in local impacts, for example. So this statement kind of highlights this point and says that the statements couldn't stand on their own. I think they need to have a kind of so what factor, like this is having a significant impact on the economy or on demand for emergency services, for example. So that was just a quote from one of the decision makers. Awesome. And then another important decision-making need was for action-oriented communication. So decision makers needed the attribution statements to be paired with relevant and clear recommendations for them to be able to address the findings that are brought up within the attribution statements. So lots of decision makers highlighted that recommended adaptation or mitigation strategies could be paired with the statements. So again, another quote to highlight this need is that something that has to come after the statements has to be, what can someone do about it? How can you change the influence of climate change? And then the fifth and final need was for scientific comprehension. So decision makers needed the science to be clear, accessible, and easy for them to understand. A lot of decision makers highlighted that larger numbers in some of the statements were more difficult for them to visualize and comprehend than some of the smaller numbers used in other statements. So this was a key finding, particularly in the southeast of Australia. So again, another quote to highlight this need is that 1.5 times in statement 2 is easier to comprehend than 14 times in the first statement, which was too hard to understand, visualize, experience, or feel. So once we were able to identify these top 5 key decision-making needs for attribution communication, we were then able to bring these needs forward to a range of expert attribution scientists, climate scientists, knowledge brokers, advisors, and other communicators to explore whether this range of stakeholders were able to meet these different decision-making needs. So we'd like to just really thank you all, if you're here today as well, for your really valuable insights for this phase of the project.
Yeah, so we hosted a 2-day workshop and had about 37 scientists and communicators who we had across different tables and had some discussions and completed surveys where we basically presented just what we've presented to you all. So the top 5 decision-making needs. And we wanted to understand from a scientist and communicator perspective what the current ability to meet those needs looks like at the moment, what's stopping scientists and communicators from meeting those, like what barriers are in the way, and what enablers and pathways could be implemented to meet these needs in the near future. And what we found was that after knowing these are important to decision makers, scientists and communicators felt that currently they could probably meet language needs, so they could take an attribution statement and improve the definitions or improve the phrasing, as well as improve the scientific comprehension. So with the methods having an idea of how to change those numbers to be more easily understood. In terms of methodology, scientists felt that they could currently meet this, so to explain a bit about the background and the baselines. However, communicators felt that we were still not able to do that, potentially because of the different kinds of methodologies that are involved in attribution. In terms of impact attribution and action-oriented communication, scientists and communicators weren't sure if we were currently able to do this, and it might need to implement some enablers and pathways forward to get through the barriers, which we'll touch on now.
Thanks, Francine. So one of the key barriers to emerge across all of the needs was stakeholder challenges. So there are 2 key components to this barrier. So for starters, communicators and scientists who we conducted the surveys with highlighted that there was a lack of knowledge about decision-making needs and the obstacles and roadblocks for attribution use amongst these users. So scientists and communicators need to be able to know those needs in order to tailor communication accordingly. And then the second component of this barrier was understanding and catering to diverse decision-making needs. Do you mind hopping back one slide? Sorry, Francie. Thank you. As we've spoken about, no one decision maker is the same. Francine and I found in our research in the 2 opposing climate regions and across government levels that different decision makers, of course, have different decision-making needs. So it's difficult to produce generalized attribution statements for a range of different needs. And then the question emerged of what barriers prevent scientists and communicators from meeting impact attribution. So one of those key decision-making needs that scientists and communicators felt that they couldn't meet yet. And the key barrier that emerged was scientific limitations. So impact attribution is a scientific field that's in its infancy. And at the moment, we don't have detailed risk, exposure, and vulnerability models that allow us to accurately see how climate change is exacerbating extreme event impacts more specifically. And then the other question emerged, what barriers prevent us from meeting action-oriented communication? So the other key decision-making need that isn't being met yet. And that was responsibility. So scientists and communicators highlighted that providing recommendations to decision makers was outside of their area of expertise or their organizations or roles scope and responsibility. So again, this quote highlights that by saying, my organization is data-oriented and does not have the capability to advise action. So a key enabler and pathway forward that was brought up to address these barriers and decision-making needs was communication expertise. So there were 2 key components to this enabler. For starters, participants highlighted the importance of having a communication expert team. So knowledge brokers were key examples that were mentioned to help these scientists and communicators better understand decision-making needs and tailor their communication accordingly. And the second dimension to this enabler was having a kit of ways to explain extreme event attribution. So a range of different ways to communicate the science to meet different decision-making needs. So Examples included graphs, visuals, and again, knowledge brokers. And then finally, the second key enabler to emerge was collaboration. So scientists and communicators highlighted the importance of building relationships with users, so decision makers in this case, of attribution work to understand their needs and then, of course, tailor communication accordingly. And key examples of how these relationships could be built included co-design, interdisciplinary research, workshops, as well as feedback.
So after the scientists and communicators shared with us these ideas around addressing barriers and enablers, we finished the workshop and asked everyone, how far away do you think we are from meeting these needs? And for 4 out of the 5, it was said that we could meet these within the next 5 years. So really working on improving language, methodology, action-oriented communication and scientific comprehension. However, for impact attribution, because that science is relatively new, that was said to be more than 5 years away. However, what decision makers are needing from impact attribution is not necessarily the scientific, perfectly lined up, tailored attribution at the impact level, but rather simple impact statements that can be added on to the end of attribution communication. So if we are able to do this in the meantime, potentially could really improve attribution communication in the very near future. So this summary of this kind of entire project is we started by understanding what decision maker needs are out of attribution communication. And then we were able to take these to scientists and communicators and say, can you meet these? And if not, how can we make this work? And we've now kind of started the process of a feedback loop where we're working through kind of like a co-design to make sure that the science that's being produced will actually be able to be used by decision makers and other end users. So it's been a really big effort, but really interesting and important to understand this process. Hannah and I would like to say a big thank you to the decision makers who we interviewed, as well as the scientists and communicators who took part. Really has helped be the key data collection out of this, and as well another thank you to our supervisors and the NESP knowledge brokers and the wider team, including Tani. So thank you, everyone. We'll now like to hand over back to Pandora to share with where this leads us now.
Thank you so much, Francine and Hannah. That's an incredible wealth of information to help guide us in our future research. What was also amazing was finding out that this kind of research isn't really being done across the world. So we're kind of world leading in this respect. But it's really helping inform what we might do in Australia. And one of the outcomes that we think should be fairly easy to work on is to build that community of attribution scientists, actually communicate amongst ourselves a little bit more, and with the communicators and service providers. And I think across Australia and New Zealand, we have a really strong community in attribution science that I think will be able to lead the way in a lot of respects. So it's a very exciting space to be working in. That said, I think that feedback loop with the decision makers will be supported if we continue the conversation, perhaps by having more interviews and discussions, but maybe even a group of decision makers that are interested could form a steering committee or something like that. This is just an idea I'm throwing out there during this webinar. Certainly, it also came out that as we develop our methods, we should also be very conscious of the language and the graphics that we're developing alongside those to make sure that they're approachable and understandable and provide enough information. Don't strip them down too much is some of the feedback that we got, but don't let them be too complex either. One thing that didn't come out of this, but we think is relevant, is to share our results rapidly. So we've been working towards having some of our methods be able to be used in an operational sense, and working with the climate services people across the Australian Climate Service and the Bureau of Meteorology to have these out. And we actually did a trial of producing attribution statements within 3 days after the end of July for the warmest Tasmanian July on record, which went pretty well, I think. And so we want to continue the conversations and learn from decision makers. And I think this will particularly help with that action-oriented information that we might add on, because as that scientist said and was quoted, we don't necessarily know what those actions will be. We do think that the decision makers have a better understanding of what actions can be made around this information that we're providing from the data side. And then working towards impact attribution, it's going to be a little bit further down the track, but really important. And so planning our research in that area is something that we can do going forward. It's really exciting. And thank you so much to the decision makers and the scientists, climate services and communication people that contributed to these results. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Pandora, and of course, Francine and Hannah. So we've wrapped all up the formalities of the slides in good time, and we're now in the Q&A time for all of your questions, hopefully, to be responded. I can see a number of them already in the Q&A, and I think a couple of people also have their hands up. So what we'll do is keep putting the questions in the Q&A. That probably is the easiest mode, typing them in, and just step through them and get through as many as we can. So the first question that I see is, I'm going to direct this one to Pandora. With the range of baseline years across the world, would clearer translation of comparison levels, for example, harmonizing pre-1990 levels and pre-2005 levels, etc., be important for decision makers? And perhaps when you respond to that one, Pandora, for those that aren't aware of the levels that are being referred to there, if you could quickly just include that in your response, that would be great. Thank you.
I think that what they're referring to, and maybe they'd like to pipe up, because I think that they're referring to the end of the simulations from the modelling institutions. So some modelling finished around the 1990s, some around 2005. But what we do to get our estimate of the likelihood or the magnitude of extremes in the current climate is actually look at a time period centered on now. So we actually look at, say, 15 degrees in the past, 15 years in the past, 15 years in the future, to find what our estimate of the likelihood of a particular extreme is in the current climate. So all of these simulations will be extended with projections. I hope that's where you were going, but and then we're comparing that with a naturalized world. So there's really no years around that comparison world.
Thanks very much, Pandora. So the next question is from Tegan, and this one will be to Francine or Hannah. Were electricity utilities included in the infrastructure and planning cohort?
Out of the people I interviewed, no. So we had a limited time frame to interview people, and that's definitely an area of future research that we're going to include in our recommendations to expand that scope. But yeah, some I can think of were people working in like main roads in Western Australia, and some of the general infrastructure and planning departments as well. But not specific to electricity, but definitely something to consider for future research.
Yeah, great question. And for some of my interviewees, the ones involved in infrastructure, they were working on the development of homes. So electricity was definitely important to them, but not necessarily a specific part of their work.
thanks for that. So the next question, I'm just going to trial this so I can see Isabel has her hand up in the chat. Isabel, did you have a question, or is that a rogue hand? And maybe while we're trying to work out if that was a question, there's a, sorry about this. Just a parallel question while we're trying to get that sorted out was, did the decision makers you interviewed say what sort of decisions are affected by attribution science, i.e. what future decisions depend on the attribution of past events? Not sure who would like to take that one.
Yeah, I can take that one first. So specific decisions weren't necessarily named. People currently using the science, I saw that in another really good question, highlighted the importance of using the science to increase their understanding and awareness of climate risks, which help them to kind of make holistic decisions. But decision makers did highlight the potential to use the science for different decisions. So adaptation decisions were highlighted as something that's potentially neglected in Australia at the moment. And these attribution findings can provide justification as to why funding needs to be increased for specific adaptation decisions, like increasing the amount of air conditioners in schools or in homes, or increasing the spatial area of green areas. So decisions like that, but adaptation and mitigation were two sorts of key areas that emerged within those decisions, but nothing super specific was named.
Because there were only about 19% of our sample who were currently using it. Most of the data we got was around where they could see it being used. And something that one of the key findings I found really interesting was interviewing people in the health area. And they said, if we knew a heat event was going to be X times more intense, this might mean we need more ambulances during a heat wave, or more staff at a hospital, if kind of relating to that impact attribution. So if you can correlate the intensity of the extreme event with the intensity of the health impacts, for example, that's something, participants from the health area were interested in doing.
Excellent. Thanks, Francine and Hannah. So the next person that has their hand up is Will Howard. Will, would you be able to go in with your question, please?
I think one of the things that I think would be useful, I think I made this point when I was talking to Hannah a couple months ago, is to make it clear whether when we talk about the climate influence on an event, are we talking about its influence on the characteristic of the event or on the occurrence of the event itself? So I think about things like heat waves, which, a heat wave they've always happened, they always will happen as anomalies above some kind of a mean state. So is attribution saying that spike, if you call it a spike for a few days, would not have happened at all without anthropogenic climate change? Or are we saying that the characteristics of that event were altered due to anthropogenic climate change? And there may be events other than heat waves for which the actual probability of the event itself might be altered by climate change. So I just want to put that question out there, maybe for whoever wants to take it, maybe Pandora.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Thank you. So in many of the techniques, we do assume that the event is sort of seen in its same structure in the current climate as in a past climate. So we are looking at that change in likelihood, but we are developing methods like that forecast-based methods where we can explore whether the event will change in its presentation, in the weather kind of setup that you have. And I think this is really exciting, particularly in Australia. We cover so many climate zones. We have so many different influences from the ocean and the upper atmosphere, that it's really interesting scientifically to explore if our events are actually changing. Another way of thinking about it is also the avoided risk. So, you know, as we go forward in time, and how these events might evolve depending on where we end up in terms of climate change. So I think it's a really interesting question, and our different methods, as I said, we're trying to develop more than one, and that's just the reason.
Thanks, Pandora, and thanks for the question, Will. So another question in the Q&A is, I think this is going to come back to you, Pandora, as well. So it's a comment and then the question. So from Ian, one really tricky issue seems to be that some of the most impactful events are some of the most complex. For example, the Lismore floods, bushfires, etc. The default assumption seems to be that the climate change is making a large contribution to these. But how do we address this when the impact attribution is still some years off?
Yeah, I agree that it's a really tricky problem. And these are quite, particularly those floods, very highly focused, localized impacts. One thing that I'm encouraged by, though, is that as we develop our methods around attributing the influence from the rainfall, say, alongside that, we've got the Australian Climate Service, who's teaming up with Geoscience Australia and the Bureau of Statistics. And so we're starting to get those overlays of vulnerability and exposure through that big program. And I think that's just really going to fast track our efforts in this space in Australia. So I think we're pretty well placed, perhaps better than that 5-year estimate, hopefully, to get into this space more quickly than we thought.
I also just wanted to add to that question. There's scientific impact attribution that might take a little bit longer to develop and line up. But from interviewing the decision makers, they didn't necessarily need the exact impact attribution, but more so even having a statement on the end saying, you know, this flood has made the impacts on, you know, loss of life or loss of infrastructure or damage to infrastructure. Simple statements like that can also have an effect on them then being able to effectively use them to influence decisions or to influence resource allocation. So there's kind of that intermediate kind of like solution while we wait for the impact attribution to be developed and tailored really specifically. I think there's still real potential to even have that simple addition to kind of boost the statement a bit.
Thanks, Francine. And the next question is still aligned to that thread, I think. So probably for Hannah or Francine to respond. Did decision makers express the need for their decisions to be soundly based in science and also able to withstand legal challenges under various laws? Did that come up in any of the conversations?
I'd say actually the opposite kind of emerged. So lots of scientists highlighted that that certainty was not a limitation to their ability to use the science. So
sorry, was that decision makers, Hannah?
Decision makers.
Yeah, okay.
Decision makers highlighted that not all of them, but some of them highlighted that they're just looking for the best available science, and to them that isn't necessarily incredibly certain science, but more so science that's come from credible sources. So the Bureau and CSIRO were two key sources that were named in that. Francine, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so we did ask them this question. We said, on a scale of 0 to 100%, how certain does the science need to be before you feel comfortable using it? And yeah, just emphasizing what Hannah said. There wasn't necessarily, everyone didn't think it needed to be above like 90%, for example. It was more about the source. But I don't think we had anyone mention the legal side. Yeah, I think because not many people are using it yet, there is potential for those in the future, but still people getting used to the idea of it and how to use it for resource allocation and prioritizing decisions. But no, we didn't have any discussions around that legal aspect.
So the next question I think will be for Pandora. And it is, when talking about impact attribution, do we only discuss the anthropogenic space or also consider ecological impacts? Or is that another field of attribution science?
So in attribution, you're thinking about and we're thinking about climate attribution here, the influence of climate change on the impacts, and in this case it might be the ecological impacts. I'm not really sure what the question's asking in terms of, we would absolutely need to know the ecological setup and the changes and the forces there, and so that is a part of the attribution, and then you would have the climate change coming in as another part, and so you would then think about how they work together to build up the message around the influence. So I think we really need to work in with the people that have expertise in these areas for impact attribution to be done well.
Thanks for that. The next question could be for any of the panel, and it is from Tracy, and it is, do you know of any examples of really effective use of attribution science?
Question.
Yes, I'm happy to take that one. So from the people that said that they were familiar with the science and using the science, those decision makers primarily used it for internal and external education, so increasing climate risk awareness and understanding, as I briefly touched on earlier. So kind of within those government departments, increasing climate risk awareness to inform decisions, but also externally when liaising with partners to, including organizations and others, to help them and make their own decisions. Of course, we have a lot of different stakeholders that need to make kind of adaptation and mitigation decisions in the face of increasing climate risks. So it's really important to continue to increase climate risk awareness. And that's where attribution, I think, plays a really significant role, and decision makers have shown that as well.
I'll just add on to that. I think not necessarily in Australia, but internationally, there is a lot of discussion around this work and like the loss and damages space and that legal side as well, which someone mentioned earlier, which is still very much like, I guess, in development and in the works, but there's definitely an emerging space of this being able to be tailored to, I guess, the idea around attributing a cause to an event and where that will fit into the legal and insurance frameworks and all of that. But yeah, not so much in Australia. This is all very new, but there has been other work like that overseas.
And I'd just like to add, it's a really great question and absolutely what's driving this sort of research. We want to find out who's using this and how are they using it. We as researchers would certainly come up with our ideas. We imagined that would be like a window to the future if you really explored the causes behind a recent extreme and help people with that communication, as Hannah said. So it's great that it's being picked up, and as we produce more results, we hope that more decision makers can use this in informing their decisions.
Excellent. Well, I think that might be the note by which we need to leave the Q&As. So I'd like to thank Hannah, Francine and Pandora for their fantastic presentations, and to all of you for your active participation and engagement in the session, and also for supporting the Climate Systems Hub and joining the webinar today. So we really hope you've taken something from the discussion, be that learnings, connections with others in this space, or a wish to stay involved in the attribution discussions. So as Pandora mentioned, I guess we're with the research scoping out how to keep those that have joined the call today and others in the loop with the progress on this research. So I guess please do stay informed with the hub or stay in touch. You can see progress of all the research on our website, and the URL is there on the slide. You can also subscribe to any of the hub's newsletters or other communications by sending an email to info@nesp2climate.com.au, and by getting on the mailing list, I guess you'll be kept in the loop with any future events that happen along this line. Please also spread the word to anyone in the climate space that may have missed today's webinar to sign up and also become part of the conversation. So we're in the early stages of planning webinars for next year, for 2024, which is fast approaching. So once again, if you have suggestions for future topics that you'd like to be covered, please email that email address which is on the slide and provide your input. That will be considered along with many other topics that we have got in the planning stage. And before we finish, we'd also really value your feedback. So when the link to the slides gets sent round the recording after the webinar, there'll be a short survey that we'd love for you to complete and to let us know how you found today's session, and whether you have any other feedback or topics that you'd like to cover in the future. So thanks again to our presenters, and for others such as Tani and many more who have been active behind the scenes to make today happen. Once again, we hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you all next time. Thank you very much.